The winter of 1947 hit Iowa with a fury that old-timers said they hadn't seen since 1888. By the second week of January, Herbert Gunderson's thermometer outside his kitchen window read 23 below zero at 6 in the morning, and the radio was calling for worse. Herbert stood at that window with his coffee growing cold in his hand, watching his breath fog the glass, doing math in his head that kept coming out the same terrible way. 200 Yorkshire hogs in his barn, his entire year's income sleeping out there in the cold. Every calculation told him the same thing. He was 3 days, maybe 4, from losing everything he'd spent 30 years building. The problem wasn't the cold itself. Hogs can survive brutal temperatures if they have proper bedding, enough depth of dry straw to insulate them from the frozen ground and give them somewhere warm to burrow. Herbert had been careful, had stocked up in November, had put away what he thought was plenty. But nobody predicted this. Nobody predicted 3 straight weeks of below-zero temperatures with no break in sight. Nobody predicted the snowstorm that hit on January 8th and buried every road in the county under 4-foot drifts that wouldn't be cleared for weeks. Herbert's hogs were burning through bedding straw at twice the normal rate. The cold was relentless, sucking heat out of everything. The animals needed more bedding, needed it deeper, needed it drier. And Herbert was down to his last 8 bales. 8 bales wouldn't last 2 days. His neighbor, Jim Patterson, had already lost 43 hogs. Herbert had helped Jim drag the frozen carcasses out of the barn 3 days ago, had seen the look on Jim's face when they both knew the man's year was ruined. Jim had another 60 hogs still alive, but getting sicker by the hour, huddled together in corners, burning calories just trying to stay warm, losing weight they'd never gain back even if they survived. 3 miles south, Ed Morrison had lost his entire operation. 130 hogs dead in 5 days. Ed had come by Herbert's place yesterday, not to visit, but to tell Herbert's wife Mary that Ed and his family were leaving, heading to Omaha where Ed's brother might have factory work. 30 years of farming, gone. Ed was 47 years old and starting over with nothing. Herbert knew he was next unless he figured something out. The roads were impassable. The phone lines were down so he couldn't even call for help. He had 8 bales of straw and 200 hogs that needed 30 inches of dry, warm bedding under them to survive. There was no possible way those 8 bales could do the job. He looked past his reflection in the frosted window, out toward his barn, and his eyes caught on something else. The ash pile. 17 metal drums sitting along the barn's north wall, filled with wood ash from his heating stove. He'd been collecting it since October, same as he did every year, same as his father had taught him back when Herbert was barely tall enough to hold a shovel. His father's voice came back to him from 40 years ago. "You never throw away ash, Herbert. Never. That ash is worth more than you know." Herbert had never questioned that instruction, had just followed it the way he followed all his father's farming wisdom. But standing there with disaster 3 days away, he realized he'd never actually asked why. His father had used ash for everything on the farm, always had drums of it sitting around, always saved every shovelful. Herbert had watched him spread it, mix it, use it in ways that seemed important at the time, but Herbert had been too young to understand. He set down his coffee cup and pulled on his coat. If his father thought ash was valuable enough to save religiously for 40 years of farming, maybe it was time Herbert figured out exactly what it could do. The walk to the barn took 10 minutes through knee-deep snow. The wind was vicious, cutting through his layers like they weren't there. By the time he reached the barn door, his face was numb and his fingers ached inside his gloves. He pulled the door open and stepped into air that was maybe 20 degrees warmer than outside, which still meant it was barely 15 degrees in the barn. The hogs were in trouble. Herbert could see it immediately. They were piled together in the far corner, 3 deep in places, desperate for any warmth they could share. Their breathing came out as thick clouds of steam that hung in the air. The ammonia smell from their urine was sharp enough to make his eyes water, burning his nose and throat even from 15 feet away. That smell meant the bedding was breaking down, getting damp and acidic, losing its insulating value and creating conditions where respiratory disease could sweep through and kill half his herd. Even if the cold didn't get them first, Herbert checked the bedding depth with his boot. 18 inches, maybe 20 in places, not nearly enough. He needed 30 inches minimum, 36 would be better. The frozen ground underneath was sucking heat out of everything above it, and once the bedding compressed down and got damp, It would turn into a cold pack that would kill the hogs faster than no bedding at all. He walked over to the first ash drum and pried off the lid. The ash was fine and grey, almost like powder. Herbert scooped up a handful and let it run through his fingers. Bone dry. He remembered his father always keeping the ash dry, storing it under cover, treating it like something precious rather than waste. Then something clicked in Herbert's memory. He'd been maybe 12 years old, following his father around the farm on a winter day not unlike this one. His father had spread ash in the hog barn, mixed it right into the bedding, and young Herbert had asked why. His father's answer came back to him now across 35 years. Ash does three things, boy. It makes heat when it mixes with the manure. It kills the stink because nothing can rot in ash. And it keeps the bedding dry because ash soaks up water like nothing else. Herbert stood there holding that handful of ash, his heart suddenly pounding. Heat, dry bedding, no ammonia. Those three things were exactly what his hogs needed to survive. And he had 17 drums of the solution sitting right there. He spent the next 4 hours spreading ash, 2 inches deep over every square foot of the barn floor, a grey blanket covering the compressed straw and manure bedding. That was all he had left. He emptied 9 of the 17 drums, working until his back screamed and his hands cramped inside his gloves, spreading the ash as evenly as he could manage. The fine powder settled into every gap in the existing bedding, coating the damp straw, mixing with the manure and urine that had accumulated. Then he broke apart his last 8 bales of straw and spread them over the ash layer, trying to make them cover as much area as possible. It looked thin. It looked inadequate. But as Herbert spread that final layer, he noticed something. His hands, which had been covered in the greasy, sticky residue of hog manure from handling the old bedding, came clean as he worked with the ash. The ash was literally scrubbing his gloves clean, pulling the grease and oil right off the fabric. Herbert pushed the thought aside. Right now, he needed to focus on whether this ash bedding would work. He'd just used up his last straw and half his ash supply on something that might accomplish absolutely nothing. If this didn't work, he had no backup plan. He had no more materials. The roads were still closed, the phones still dead, the temperature still dropping. He walked back to the house as the sun was setting, his body exhausted. Mary met him at the door with hot coffee and questions in her eyes that she didn't ask out loud. She could see the answer on his face. He didn't know if what he'd done would work. They'd find out by morning whether they still had a farm or whether they'd be following Ed Morrison to Omaha looking for factory work. That night was the coldest yet. The thermometer hit 27 below zero. Herbert barely slept, listening to the wind howl outside, thinking about those hogs in the barn, thinking about 30 years of work that might end because winter came harder than anyone expected. He was up before dawn, pulling on his boots in the dark, his stomach tight with dread. The walk through the snow seemed endless. Herbert's hands were shaking as he reached for the barn door, and not from the cold. He pulled it open, stepped inside, and stopped. The hogs weren't huddled. They were spread out across the barn floor, lying on their sides, relaxed and comfortable. As Herbert stood there, barely breathing, one of the big sows stood up, stretched like she'd just had the best sleep of her life, walked calmly to the water trough, and drank before finding a new spot to lie down. Herbert walked on legs that didn't feel entirely steady to the nearest group of hogs, and knelt down, pulling off his glove. He pushed his bare hand into the bedding 6 inches down. Warm. Not just less cold, but genuinely warm. He pushed deeper, and 8 inches down the bedding was as warm as a summer afternoon. The chemical reaction between the ash and the manure was generating actual heat, and the ash layer was trapping that heat right where the hogs needed it. Herbert took a deep breath and realized the ammonia smell was completely gone. The barn air was clean. The bedding surface was dry to the touch, even though the hogs had been urinating on it all night. Herbert sat back on his heels, and for the first time in 2 weeks he felt like he could breathe properly. This wasn't just working slightly better than straw alone. This was better than anything he'd ever used. His hogs were more comfortable now with 8 bales and some ash than they'd been 2 weeks ago, with 30 bales of straw. He'd saved his farm with something he would have thrown away. The storm kept the roads closed for 13 more days, and during that time something else happened that Herbert hadn't expected. His neighbor, Frank Kowalski, showed up on the 3rd day after the ash bedding, fighting his way through the snow on foot, because his truck couldn't make it through the drifts. Frank looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed and his face was drawn. "Herbert, I'm losing my chickens." They went inside where it was warm, and Frank explained his crisis. His laying hens, 100 of them, were his only source of cash income through the winter. Eggs brought in maybe $30 a week, enough to buy groceries and keep the lights on until spring planting. But the hens had developed a severe mite infestation. The red mites were hiding in the cracks of the wooden coop during the day and coming out at night to feed on the chicken's blood. The hens weren't sleeping, weren't eating properly, and had almost stopped laying entirely. Frank was getting maybe 15 eggs a day from 100 hens. "I'm 2 weeks from having no income at all," Frank said, his voice flat. "The feed store has powder that might work, but it costs $8 and I'd need 3 containers to treat the whole coop. I don't have $24, Herbert. I've got maybe $11 to my name until I can sell eggs again, and I can't sell eggs if the hens won't lay." Herbert listened, thinking about his grandmother's chicken operation from when he was a boy. He had a sudden clear memory of watching her spread ash in wooden boxes in the chicken yard, and the hens rolling in it, coating their feathers until they looked like grey ghosts. "My grandmother kept the best laying flock in 3 counties, Herbert said slowly. "Never had mite problems that I remember. She used ash, Frank, had dust bath boxes filled with ash and sand." Frank stared at him. "Ash? Like wood ash?" 2 parts ash to 1 part sand. The chickens roll in it, coat their feathers. I think it kills the mites somehow, changes the environment on their skin so the mites can't survive." Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've got nothing else to try. If it doesn't work, I'm finished anyway." Herbert gave Frank 2 drums of ash. Frank loaded them on a sled and dragged them home through the snow. Herbert didn't hear from him for 4 days, long enough that he started worrying the ash hadn't worked, that he'd given Frank false hope that had made things worse somehow. Then Frank showed up at Herbert's door on the 4th evening, and his face told the story before he said a word. "It worked," Frank said, and his voice broke slightly. "I set up 4 shallow boxes filled with your ash and sand. The hens went crazy for it, Herbert. Every single hen used those boxes within the first hour, rolling and flapping until they were covered in grey powder. By the next morning, they were calmer. By the second day, they were eating normally again. This morning, I collected 68 eggs. 68 eggs from 100 hens in the middle of January." Frank stopped, looking embarrassed, and then said quietly, "You saved my winter, Herbert. Maybe saved my farm. I don't know how to thank you for that." After Frank left, Herbert sat at his kitchen table with Mary, and they talked about what was happening. 2 farms saved with ash in 1 week. How many other farmers were struggling right now with problems that ash could solve if only they remembered it was possible? "Your mother used ash in the garden," Herbert said to Mary. "Every spring, thick over the vegetable beds, said it sweetened the soil." Mary nodded. "Her garden always produced twice what anyone else's did. I thought she just had a gift for growing things. But maybe it was the ash." The next morning, Herbert walked over to Jim Patterson's place. Jim had lost 43 hogs already, but he still had 60 animals alive, and those 60 hogs represented Jim's only chance of having income this year. Herbert found Jim in his barn, looking at hogs that were thin and sick, huddled together, clearly suffering. "Jim, I want to show you something," Herbert said. He brought Jim back to his own barn and showed him the hogs, healthy and comfortable on the ash bedding. He explained what he'd done, how much ash he'd used, how the ash had created heat and controlled moisture and eliminated the ammonia. Jim listened with an expression that went from skeptical to desperate to hopeful. "You think it would work for me?" Jim asked. "I've got maybe 20 inches of bedding left and it's getting damp. The ammonia smell is so bad I can barely stand to go in there." "I've got 8 drums of ash left," Herbert said. "Take 4 drums. Spread it 2 inches deep over what you've got. It won't save the hogs you already lost, but it might save the 60 you've still got." Jim took the ash. 2 days later, he reported that his hogs were doing better, not dying anymore, starting to eat normally again. They'd lost weight they'd never fully gained back, but they'd survive, and survival meant Jim would have some income this year instead of none. When the roads finally cleared in early February, word had spread. The county extension agent came by Herbert's farm specifically to see the ash bedding system. He walked through the barn, examined the bedding, checked the temperature at different depths, interviewed Herbert about quantities and application methods. Then he did something Herbert hadn't expected. He asked if Herbert would be willing to demonstrate the system at the next farmers' meeting. "We've got farms failing all over the county," the agent said. "Your system costs nothing but labor. Ours is a waste product, and it works better than commercial bedding even when commercial bedding is available. This is information that could save operations, Herbert. People need to know this." Herbert agreed, though speaking in front of groups made him uncomfortable. But at the March farmers' meeting at the grain elevator, he found himself standing in front of 43 farmers, explaining what his father had taught him about ash, what he'd figured out through desperate experimentation, what results he'd seen. He brought Frank Kowalski with him to talk about the chicken mite solution. They brought Jim Patterson to talk about saving his surviving hogs. The questions went on for 2 hours. Farmers wanted to know specifics. How much ash per square foot? How deep should the base bedding be? Did it work for dairy cattle? What about sheep? Could you use it in horse stalls? Did the type of wood matter? How dry did the ash need to be kept? Herbert answered what he could and admitted when he didn't know. An older farmer named Albert Schmidt, who had to be close to 80, stood up in the back and added information Herbert hadn't known. Albert's father had used ash to preserve root vegetables, packing potatoes and carrots in layers of ash in the root cellar. The vegetables lasted until May, far longer than any other storage method. Another old-timer talked about using ash for cleaning equipment, for making soap, for keeping insects away from grain storage. A woman in her 70s remembered her mother using ash water to wash wool before spinning it. The knowledge was there, scattered through the memories of the oldest generation, waiting to be remembered by farmers who needed it. By the end of the meeting, Herbert realized something important was happening. Knowledge that had been fading, dismissed as old-fashioned or unnecessary, was being recognized as valuable again because circumstances had made it necessary. The brutal winter had reminded everyone that modern conveniences could disappear quickly, and when they did, the old methods weren't quaint nostalgia. They were survival tools. Spring came eventually the way it always does. When Herbert spread his remaining ash on his corn ground before planting, he did it with new attention, watching for results his father had told him to expect but he'd never fully believed. The corn on the ash-treated ground germinated faster, grew darker green, developed thicker stalks that could resist wind damage. By midsummer, it was obvious the ash-treated sections were going to significantly out-yield the sections that only got commercial fertilizer. Herbert did the math. He'd spread roughly 50 pounds of ash per 1,000 square feet. If he'd bought the equivalent minerals in commercial form from the co-op, it would have cost him about $3 per 1,000 square feet, or roughly $130 for his 15 acres of corn ground. He'd gotten that value from something he used to throw away. But the real value showed up at harvest. The ash-treated corn yielded 12 bushels per acre, more than the commercial fertilizer sections. At market price that year, that was an additional $48 per acre of income. Multiply that by 15 acres, and Herbert had made an extra $720 from ash that cost him nothing but collection and spreading labor. Mary's garden told the same story. She'd spread ash heavily on her vegetable beds in April, and by July her tomatoes were loaded with fruit, dark green and healthy, with no sign of the blossom end rot that usually ruined a third of her crop. The calcium in the ash had prevented the problem completely. Her peppers, both sweet and hot, produced twice their normal yield. The potassium in the ash had given them exactly what they needed. When the livestock buyer made his rounds in late summer, he spent extra time at Herbert's farm. Herbert's hogs, the ones that had survived that brutal winter on ash bedding, had gained weight steadily through spring and summer. They averaged 15 pounds heavier than standard because they'd spent the winter comfortable instead of cold-stressed, and comfortable animals convert feed to meat more efficiently. The buyer calculated the numbers while Herbert watched. You made an extra $300 on this group just from the better winter weight gain. Add in the money you saved on bedding straw, the money you saved on fertilizer, the increased crop yield from the ash treatment, and you're looking at almost $1,500 of additional income from ash this year, from something most farmers throw away. Herbert nodded. He'd already done the math himself. had already realized that ash had been the difference between a profitable year and a break-even year, maybe the difference between keeping the farm and losing it. But there was something else, the buyer said, that stayed with Herbert for a long time after. The farmers who survived this winter were the ones who remembered the old ways or figured them out fast enough. The ones who relied completely on commercial products and modern methods. They're the ones who failed when the roads closed and the stores were empty. That's worth thinking about, Herbert. Modern doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means more expensive and less resilient. Herbert thought about that a lot over the next few years. He kept saving ash, kept finding new uses for it, kept learning from old-timers who remembered things his generation had forgotten. He started writing things down, creating a record of ash applications and results, making sure the knowledge wouldn't be lost when the people who remembered it passed away. His son grew up watching Herbert save ash, spread ash, use ash for a dozen different purposes around the farm. The young man learned it wasn't old-fashioned or backward. It was smart farming, using available resources efficiently, having solutions ready for problems that might come unexpectedly. 33 years after the winter of '47, when Herbert's son took over the farm operation, one of the first things he did was make sure the ash collection drums were in place and properly maintained. He might never face a crisis as severe as his father had faced, but if he did, he'd have the tools to handle it. The winter of 1947 taught Herbert Gunderson something that shaped the rest of his farming life. The knowledge his father and grandparents had preserved, wisdom that seemed unnecessary when times were good, that same knowledge had saved his operation when modern methods weren't available. Throwing away ash meant throwing away solutions to problems he might not face until it was too late to prepare for them. Real farming wisdom isn't about being old-fashioned. It's about understanding your resources, knowing what they can do, having solutions ready before you desperately need them. Herbert's 17 drums of ash had saved 200 hogs, rescued his neighbor's chicken operation, provided minerals for his crops, and generated more than $1,500 in additional income. All from something most people treated as waste. That's why old farmers never threw away ashes. Not because they were poor or backward, but because they understood something that too many modern farmers had forgotten. Waste is expensive, resources are valuable, and you never know when the crisis will come that makes the difference between survival and failure. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this story valuable, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with others who appreciate traditional farming wisdom. This content is inspired by real historical events and actual farming methods used during the 1930s through 1970s. This video does not aim to represent or offend any specific individuals or groups. Herbert Gunderson is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations and used these exact ash preservation practices during this era to save their operations and sustain their families through brutal winters.